The entire book of Ruth culminates at the scene in the city gate in chapter 4. And in this episode, we're gonna look at that. We're gonna talk about why is there a sandal involved? Why does the first Redeemer say, I can do it, but then I can't do it? And what are the implications of what comes out of that scene for our lives today and what God wants to do in the midst of our story and the stories of those we get to touch? Friends, we are moving towards the climactic moment in the book of Ruth. And where Brad left us at the end of the last episode is Boaz and Ruth having a conversation on the threshing floor where Ruth says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, for you are a redeemer." And that word redeemer is very significant to the story. We're going to get into that in just a few moments. But the way that that conversation ends is Boaz saying, yes, I am a redeemer, but there's actually one in line ahead of me. And so to understand what he meant by that and how that gets played out, we get to dip into chapter 4. And so let's look at verse 1 of chapter 4. It goes like this. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. Now, the location of this, we're told, is in the gate. That's very important to the story because city gates served multiple functions. The first function is an area of traffic. People came in and out, like you have here at the ancient city of Gezer, one of the most beautiful gates you will see in the land of Israel. It is a 6-chamber gate that dates back to the time of Solomon. To give you a little perspective shot, you got this kid here in the corner. But one of the things that city gates also function as was the courthouse. So all of the legal matters connected to a town or a village or a city would take place in the city gate. And in these excavations, you see benches within the city gates that people would have sat there, sure. But when you're talking about a legal scene or a court scene, this is where the elders of the city would sit. And so we open up this story with a city gate, which tells us that Boaz is engaging in a legal conversation with the Redeemer that's in line ahead of him. And now we get to this language again, Redeemer. The word Redeemer that is used in the book of Ruth, and here in chapter 4, as we're going to look at this a couple of times, is the word Goel. And it gets translated in our English as either kinsman redeemer, guardian redeemer, family guardian. You'll see it a number of different ways depending upon your translation. But the essence of a Goel is that they're the nearest adult male relative. Remember, women were under the protection of men. So this is about an adult male relative who's responsible for coming to the aid of a relative in serious trouble or need. And there's all of these stipulations laid out to the activity of a kinsman redeemer that you can read about in Leviticus 25. But the idea here is that when someone is in need, you have a male that steps in order to redeem or to restore the situation that's at hand. And so we're told that Boaz then took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech." Now, this selling the parcel of land is new information here in Ruth. And for many of us listening to this feels problematic because we've been saying all along that Naomi has no rights to the property that she had before her and Elimelech left to go to Moab. But now we're told that she is selling the parcel of land. This language is problematic because it seems to imply that she's had rights to the land all along. Well, what she has attached to the land is the family name, but according to Numbers 27, if the male head of the household dies and sons die as well, then there is a transfer of property that goes between men within the family, within the larger clan. And so when we're told that she is selling the parcel of land, she really doesn't have any rights to the land. In fact, by law, she can't raise crops on that land or sell them. But what can happen here is that if a Goel steps into that role of a kinsman redeemer and is able to acquire the land back, now it's staying in connection to that family name, and therefore the land gets placed back into the inheritance stream of the family of who the elder father or the sons died from, i.e. Naomi's family in this story. And so what's being communicated here is that when they left to go to Moab, perhaps the land got passed on to somebody else in the family. Maybe there's a squatter there. We don't know the situation, but if a Goel steps in, then that land goes back to Naomi under the protective covering of the Goel who steps in, okay? And you can, again, read more about this in Numbers 27, but the option for the Goel to engage in the role of being a Goel is on the table, is what Boaz is saying. So Boaz continues, and he says, so I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. So the matter is brought to his attention, and no doubt he's already knows what's going on here. Bethlehem is not a very big place. Ruth and Naomi have been there for quite some time. We're going through barley harvest, and there's also reference that they went through the wheat harvest as well. And so this kinsman redeemer knows he has the opportunity to step into this role, but according to the Torah, it's optional. He doesn't have to do it. It's kind of frowned upon if you don't do it in an honor and shame society. And he says, sounds like a good deal. I'm in. But then Boaz throws in a curveball here. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. He's referring here to what we call Levirate marriage. And to be a Levir is to be someone who steps in, a family member, in the time of need when a man has died and his wife has been left as a widow. This is from Deuteronomy 25, 5 and 6. It spells it out a little bit clearer. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. So Boaz is saying, well, hey, Ruth is there as well, and you need to engage in marriage with her. And as a result of Boaz highlighting this, and this man knowing, the implications of this, responds with, then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. In order to understand what just happened in this moment, it's helpful to have a diagram that walks through who's involved and what the implications are. So we begin with Elimelech and Naomi. They have two sons, Machlon and Chilion. Elimelech dies, the boys marry Moabite wives, and then both of the boys die as well. Orpah is going to leave the situation, and it leaves us with Naomi and Ruth. With the presence now of the Redeemer, that brings in his land and his family into the conversation. He is married, no doubt, talks about this. He doesn't want to impair his inheritance, which means he's got a family, he's got kids, he has a firstborn son, no doubt somewhere in this equation. Boaz says that if you step into the role of the Redeemer, then you will acquire Naomi to be part of your family. In the mind of the Redeemer, he's like, okay, this is great because Ruth isn't part of the story, and therefore there is no division because Ruth isn't part of this. Land and family from Naomi comes over to my side, and now it is one family with a larger inheritance. Now, his role is going to be he's got to acquire the land back, whatever that's going to cost him, and to take care of Naomi for the rest of her life. But again, with his enlarged estate, he goes, this is worth it. But again, here's the curveball. When Boaz says, actually, Ruth is still in the picture, and on the day that you acquire Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth to live into this Levirate. You will be married to Ruth, and as a result of this marriage, the Redeemer knows, okay, now we still have a division because the inheritance side comes back over here. And when the Redeemer and Ruth have a child, a firstborn son, it will be as if Machlon had had that son with Ruth under that Levirate marriage. And therefore, as the firstborn son seen as part of this couple, the inheritance stream will go through the firstborn son of Ruth, and as if Machlon had done that. Now, some people look at that and say that their firstborn son would actually supersede the firstborn son of the Redeemer's first marriage, and therefore all of the inheritance would come over here. Others would say, actually, that's not the case, but the problem is you now have two firstborn sons that will have access to an inheritance stream, and with that, the Redeemer says, I can't do that. That's going to impair my own inheritance. Boaz, you step in and you take over for this situation. And then we read this. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. What we have on the scene here is a sandal, but there is confusion and even disagreement among scholars as to whose sandal are we actually referring to. The text is ambiguous. Some will say that the grammar here is talking about the Redeemer's sandal. Others will say that the grammar here is talking about Boaz's sandal. And the reason why there are two different options here is how you interpret the sandal's presence and symbolism in the moment. Clearly, this was a former custom because even the writer is saying, hey, in former times, this happened, so there is some confusion around it. But if it is the Redeemer's sandal, the way that this is explained is that when the option is given to him to step into this role and he says, I'm not going to be able to do it, by him taking off his sandal and handing it to Boaz was the legal way of saying, I give you the right to step in and be the kinsman redeemer, even though I was ahead of you in line, I am not taking on that role, you can take it. So that's traditionally how it has been taught. The other option here, and what some scholars contend, is that because the purpose of Boaz stepping in is to allow the name of Machlon and Elimelech to continue on, his name is going to take a backseat to their name. And so by Boaz taking off his sandal, it's a way of saying, I am removing my name from the situation, and symbolically, I am putting on the sandal of Machlon, of Elimelech, of that family line, because the act that I'm going to engage in is going to restore their name so that it isn't forgotten, it isn't blotted out. I am doing this for their memory, for the benefit of their family. Yes, Boaz is going to receive in return Ruth, but he's also doing this at a cost to himself and his own name to live faithfully into God's commandments and into restoring a family that was brought to famine. And so you see that we have a sandal that is on the scene. And actually, sandals have been found in archaeological excavation. Clearly, this person had very narrow feet. I mean, those are some narrow sandals right there. But we have a sandal that is on the scene. And once the sandal has been removed, whether it is the other redeemer or Boaz, the presence of the sandal, we have this climactic moment here in Ruth 4. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Machlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Machlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." And it is just a spectacular moment that comes to fruition in the city gate. A sandal is on the scene, and it's in this moment that Boaz took responsibility for another. And if I had to just kind of summarize into a very short statement, just what this story, this climactic moment does for me, is to look on at what Boaz has done and just to ask the question, like, how can I be that for someone else? How can you be that for someone else? Because when Boaz either takes off the sandal or receives the sandal, that sandal in that moment represents darkness became light. We're in a dark period of the Judges, and yet you have this bright light of Ruth and Boaz and the incredible integrity and now the marriage that has come together. Hopelessness became hope. The hopelessness that Ruth felt, the hopelessness that Naomi felt, like they have been brought to a place of hope because Boaz took responsibility. Emptiness became fullness. And it was symbolized around the presence of a sandal, which again just gives us something to wrestle with, something to ponder, to ask the question, where may God be calling us to take responsibility for another? And to recognize that it will actually cost us something in order to do that. But love is costly. God's love for us was costly. The most compelling kind of love is costly. And it cost Boaz something to step into this role. Yes, he received in return, but he also had to make the decision that he was going to focus on someone else and come to the aid of someone else, to take responsibility for a situation for someone that didn't have the capacity to do that on their own. And maybe right now, God is helping you to see a situation, a person, where you can be that to them. Whether it's someone who's in financial need, maybe it's a really great initiative that you know could help a lot of people get something, a basic need that they're not able to get on their own. Maybe for some of you, like you've had this stirring for some time, to enter into the foster care system, to be one who provides a home for someone who doesn't currently have a home. This could go so many different ways. And I think that one of the reasons why we are so drawn to the story of Ruth and Boaz is because we see the fidelity, the integrity, the generosity that we see in Ruth and Boaz, this chesed that we talked about in terms of how God loves people well. His covenantal faithfulness is we see it being all over the pages of the book of Ruth. And we're compelled by that because we recognize that that is love in its truest form. And so may you wrestle with the implications of being one who brings a sandal into the moment and takes responsibility for another. Well, friends, there you go. There is part 5 of our series in Ruth. We've got one more episode left. It is going to be fantastic. Can't wait for you to hear what is shared in our last episode. So thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. And as always, may you walk out the text well in your life.